Sign the compliance waiver by 5 o'clock or your $1,200,000 equity grant is canceled. CFO Victor Thorne sneered, slamming the audit folder onto my glass desk. I didn't flinch. I slowly unplugged my RSA cryptographic token from the terminal, packed my briefcase, and walked out of headquarters forever. 6 months before that rainy Thursday afternoon, Vantage Health Systems was still functioning like a clockwork engine. I am Harold Vance. At 51 years old, I had spent 18 years building the regulatory compliance infrastructure of this company from the ground up. When I started back in 2008 at age 33, Vantage was a regional distributor of clinical diagnostic machinery generating barely $12 million in annual revenue. My job was straightforward back then. Build an airtight quality control framework, enforce strict adherence to federal medical distribution statutes, and ensure that every piece of equipment passing through our logistics chain met rigid regulatory standards. Over 18 years, I grew with the firm. As Senior Director of Regulatory Compliance and Quality Audit, I managed a team of 6 certified internal auditors. By 2026, Vantage Health Systems had expanded into a NASDAQ-listed corporation pulling in $100 million in annual recurring revenue across 14 regional distribution hubs. Our reputation was spotless, built entirely on my insistence that we never cut corners on regulatory compliance. In our industry, skipping a step on audit documentation isn't just an administrative mistake. It can lead to blacklists from federal health authorities, immediate license revocations, and catastrophic product recalls. I spent my mornings reviewing automated system logs and verifying cryptographic checksums. Under federal law, specifically Section 404 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 11, every automated entry in our inventory ledger required immutable audit trails. To handle this massive operational footprint, I personally architected our automated compliance tracking system. We called it the System Compliance Matrix, powered by 200,000 individual automated checksum verification tokens embedded directly into our enterprise server architecture. Among the senior engineering staff, these tokens were known as the 200K compliance code. The system was designed so that every single warehouse shipment, quality assurance clearance, and financial ledger transaction required a real-time validation token generated by the 200K code. And under federal securities mandates and our corporate charter, the master cryptographic signing key that authorized the 200K code was registered under my personal credentials with the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Department of Justice. Without my active master token plugged into the central validation server, no quarterly compliance certificate could be legally submitted to federal regulators, and no corporate transaction over $50,000 could be finalized. For nearly 2 decades, the founder of Vantage, a pragmatic executive named Leonard Thorne, respected my boundaries. Leonard was 64, a corporate strategist who understood that a single regulatory fine could obliterate millions in shareholder value. But 18 months ago, Leonard's health began to decline, and he started planning his exit strategy. He appointed his 42-year-old nephew, Victor Thorne, as Chief Financial Officer. Victor was a modern corporate climber with an MBA from an Ivy League school and a complete disdain for operational safeguards. To Victor, compliance was not a protective barrier. It was an expensive friction point slowing down corporate expansion. The friction between Victor and my department started almost immediately. Victor was focused on one goal: prepping Vantage Health Systems for a massive takeover. A multinational healthcare investment group, MedGlobe Capital, had submitted a non-binding letter of intent to acquire Vantage for $450 million, a lucrative valuation based on a 4.5 times revenue multiple. For Leonard Thorne and his nephew Victor, this takeover was their golden parachute. Victor owned a 3% equity stake that would net him over $13 million upon closing, while Leonard held 40% of the common voting stock. My own stake in the company was tied to a long-term retention agreement signed 18 years prior. Clause 12B of my executive employment contract granted me a non-dilutable stock option grant, valued at $1.2 million, scheduled to vest precisely on October 1st, 2026, marking my 18th anniversary with the company. It was a fair reward for nearly 2 decades of protecting the corporation from ruin. By late August, MedGlobe Capital initiated its final due diligence phase. Their legal team sent over a 500-page compliance checklist requiring verified audit logs for all medical device inventory processed over the previous 24 months. That was when Victor began interfering directly with my department. It started with small requests. Victor's assistant would email asking me to expedite compliance sign-offs for delayed shipments from our Midwest distribution center. I refused. If an automated inventory batch failed its secondary calibration check, it stayed on hold until my auditors manually verified the hardware. Victor called me into his office on a Tuesday morning, pacing behind his mahogany desk. "Harold, you're looking at regulatory guidelines like it's 1995, Victor said, adjusting his gold cufflinks. MedGlobe's auditors want the due diligence folder closed by September 15th. We can't have $64 million worth of inventory sitting in audit limbo because your team is waiting on physical recalibration reports." Victor, federal law mandates a 72-hour hold on uncalibrated diagnostic units. I replied calmly, "If I override the 200K code validation, we're committing wire fraud and falsifying federal compliance submissions. Section 404 requires absolute transparency." Victor smirked, leaning over his desk. "Section 404 is a guideline, Harold. Business is about risk management. Clear the inventory hold, or you're holding up a $450 million deal." I stood up, holding my leather folder tightly. "I don't manage risk by breaking federal statutes, Victor. My name is on the SEC registration. Until the physical checks pass, the audit lock stays." What Victor didn't realize was that he wasn't just asking me to clear routine paperwork. He was trying to hide a massive operational defect that threatened the entire buyout, and he was willing to destroy my career to force it through. By the first week of September, the tension inside our headquarters had reached a boiling point. I instructed my senior compliance analyst Diana Foster, a sharp 34-year-old auditor who had been with my team for 7 years, to conduct a comprehensive deep dive into the Midwest Distribution Center's system logs. Diana spent 3 days cross-referencing our automated server records against physical warehouse receipts. What she uncovered was far worse than routine corporate impatience. On Thursday morning, Diana walked into my glass-walled office and closed the door behind her. She placed a stack of printed audit logs on my desk, her expression pale. "Harold, you need to look at this," Diana said quietly, pointing to a line item flagged in neon yellow. 2 weeks ago, Victor authorized an emergency wire transfer of $200,000 to an offshore software consulting firm based in Panama. The payment was categorized as a routine enterprise server database patch. I scanned the system line items. A database patch doesn't require a $200,000 manual disbursement without my signature. What did the patch actually modify? It tried to force a manual override on 12,000 cardiac monitoring units stored in our Chicago warehouse, Diana explained, her voice dropping. Those units failed their primary circuit integrity tests back in July. Under FDA guidelines, they require complete circuit board replacements before they can be cleared for clinical distribution. But replacing those boards would cost $3.8 million and take 4 months, delaying the MedGlobe buyout until next year. I leaned back in my executive chair, processing the severity of what Diana had found. Victor hadn't just tried to rush paperwork. He had authorized an illegal software patch, a rogue script designed to bypass the 200K compliance code tokens in our central database. He had tried to fake regulatory compliance for 12,000 defective medical devices worth $64 million just to keep the $450 million buyout on schedule. However, Victor's ignorance of our system architecture was his fatal flaw. The 200K code wasn't just a static database field that could be overwritten by a simple SQL query. It was an immutable cryptographic chain. When Victor's rogue Panamanian software script attempted to force a pass status on the defective inventory, the system automatically detected a signature mismatch. Instead of clearing the inventory, The central server generated over 40,000 automated compliance exception flags, freezing the entire $64 million inventory batch in place and preventing MedGlobe's audit team from verifying the assets. Victor was trapped. His illegal $200,000 override script had locked the system even tighter, and the only way to clear those 40,000 exception flags and validate the asset ledger was for me to insert my physical RSA master hardware token into the central terminal and execute a formal SEC system compliance override waiver. On Thursday afternoon, September 24th, exactly 6 days before my $1.2 million equity grant was scheduled to vest, I received an urgent summons to the executive boardroom on the top floor. When I entered the room, CFO Victor Thorn was standing at the head of the dark walnut conference table. Sitting beside him was founder and chairman Leonard Thorn, looking frail but stern, flanked by the company's outside corporate legal counsel. Victor didn't offer me a chair. He pointed to a single red folder sitting on the table. "Harold, we're out of time," Victor snapped, his eyes bloodshot from stress. "MedGlobe's legal counsel is flying in tomorrow morning to execute the final asset purchase agreement. Your automated compliance system is throwing flags on the Chicago inventory, blocking $64 million in transferable assets. I have prepared an emergency system compliance override waiver right there." I didn't open the folder. "Victor, those 12,000 units failed primary circuit checks. They are physically defective. Executing a compliance waiver on uncalibrated cardiac monitors violates FDA 21 CFR Part 11 and constitutes material fraud under SEC Rule 10b-5. Chairman Leonard Thorn leaned forward, resting his hands on his cane. "Harold, you've been with this company for 18 years. I hired you, but Vantage cannot afford to lose a $450 million acquisition over rigid regulatory pedantry. Sign the waiver, clear the audit flags, and let the lawyers handle the rest." "Leonard, with all due respect, my name and federal credentials are registered as the independent compliance officer on file with the SEC," I answered evenly. "If I execute this waiver, I am personally committing federal securities fraud. I will not sign it." Victor stepped forward, his face flushing red with anger. "Listen to me, you arrogant relic. You work for this board. You sign that waiver by 5 o'clock today, or your employment is terminated immediately for cause. Effective right now." The room went dead silent. Terminating me for cause was a blatant tactic to void my employment contract, stripping away my $1.2 million stock option grant 5 days before it vested on October 1st. Victor leaned over the table, sneering at me. "Sign the compliance waiver by 5 o'clock, or your $1,200,000 equity grant is canceled. You'll walk out of here with nothing." I looked at Victor, then at Leonard. Neither of them showed a shred of hesitation. 18 years of flawless service sacrificed for a dirty corporate payout. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam the table. I simply looked Victor in the eyes. "Understood," I said. I turned around, opened the boardroom doors, and walked back down to my office. My assistant watched nervously as I opened my desk drawer, removed my personal leather briefcase, and began packing my family photographs. Then I sat down at my central terminal, opened the master compliance portal, and removed my physical RSA, cryptographic hardware security, token from the server port. I placed the token securely inside my inner jacket pocket, picked up my briefcase, handed my magnetic security badge to the floor manager, and walked out of the building into the autumn rain. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They had no idea they had just pulled the pin on their own grenade. That evening, I sat in the office of Lawrence Cole, a veteran 54-year-old regulatory attorney specializing in federal securities litigations and Sarbanes-Oxley whistleblower protections. Lawrence had spent 25 years prosecuting corporate fraud cases in federal courts, and he knew the exact mechanics of federal compliance law. I placed my leather briefcase on Lawrence's desk and pulled out a secure external hard drive containing complete encrypted system logs, along with my physical RSA master hardware security token. "Let me get this completely straight, Harold," Lawrence said, putting on his reading glasses as he reviewed the documents. "Victor Thorn terminated you for cause because you refused to execute a fraudulent compliance waiver on $64 million worth of uncalibrated medical inventory. Precisely, I replied calmly. And he did it 6 days before my $1.2 million stock option grant was scheduled to vest on October 1st. He thinks that by removing me from the building, he can force his IT staff to bypass the 200K compliance code and close the deal with Medglobe Capital. Lawrence leaned back in his leather chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. Victor Thorne just committed the single biggest tactical blunder in corporate financial history. He has no idea how federal compliance statutes operate. Lawrence opened a volume of federal securities law and began laying out the legal trap Victor had unknowingly stepped into, first under Section 404 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, codified at 15 U.S.C. 7262, and federal corporate governance mandates. My designation as the company's independent compliance officer was officially registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission. When a publicly traded company terminates its primary designated compliance officer over a material auditing disagreement, federal law strictly requires the corporation to file an emergency Form 8K disclosure with the SEC within 4 business days. The disclosure must explicitly state whether the officer's departure was related to internal control disagreements. If Victor filed an 8K claiming my departure was routine, he would be committing direct perjury to federal regulators. If he disclosed the disagreement, Medglobe's legal team would immediately cancel the acquisition. Second, the cryptographic master key contained within the physical RSA hardware token resting on Lawrence's desk was the sole authorized digital signature for the 200,000 automated compliance tokens. The 200K code, without that physical hardware key, connected directly to the primary authentication server in our headquarters basement. The corporate central database could not generate valid compliance certificates for any international shipments or corporate asset transfers exceeding $50,000. Third, under 18 U.S.C. Paragraph 15 4A, the statutory whistleblower protection provision established under Sarbanes-Oxley and expanded by the Dodd-Frank Act, terminating an employee for refusing to participate in securities fraud or for reporting internal control violations, carries severe civil and criminal penalties. Lawrence pointed to Clause 12B of my original 2008 employment contract. Look at this provision, Harold. Your contract explicitly states that if your employment is terminated without cause or through retaliatory discharge prior to an executive vesting date, all unvested equity grants immediately accelerate and vest in full. Furthermore, Clause 12B mandates a double multiplier severance payout equal to 24 months of executive base salary. At your base pay of $15,000 per month, that's $360,000 doubled. $720,000 in cash severance alone. Combined with your $1.2 million stock option grant and statutory whistleblower damages, Victor's little temper tantrum just created a $3.6 million financial liability for Vantage Health Systems. At 11 o'clock that evening, working from Lawrence's law office, we officially submitted a comprehensive 47-page whistleblower disclosure to the SEC's Office of the Whistleblower and the Department of Justice Corporate Fraud Task Force. Attached to the submission were digital evidence copies of the $200,000 Panamanian wire transfer invoice, the rogue SQL database override script, and the automated exception logs for the 12,000 defective cardiac monitors in Chicago. While we were submitting the federal filings, panic was already breaking out back at Vantage headquarters. On Friday morning, September 25th, CFO Victor Thorne arrived at the office, determined to force the system open. Believing that my termination had eliminated the final obstacle, Victor summoned the Vice President of Information Technology into the server room. Victor demanded that the IT team execute an administrative root-level override command to wipe the 40,000 compliance exception flags and generate the clearance certificates for Medglobe Capital. At 8:15 a.m., the IT vice president logged into the central mainframe using super administrator credentials and executed a manual database bypass command. He had no idea how the 200K code architecture was built. The moment the administrative override command was executed without my physical RSA hardware token present, to sign the cryptographic handshake, The system kernel flagged the operation as a critical security breach and an unauthorized administrative intrusion on an SEC-monitored asset ledger. The automated system safety protocol triggered instantaneously. Across all 14 regional distribution centers, every automated warehouse conveyance system ground to a complete halt. The central database revoked all active bill of lading export manifests. And most devastatingly, the server automatically transmitted an encrypted high-priority system tampering alert directly to the SEC's Division of Enforcement, Automated Monitoring Grid in Washington, D.C. Victor Thorne stood in the server room watching the main monitors turn solid red as red warning banners flashed across every terminal screen in the building. SE compliance lockout activated. All asset transfers frozen by federal order. The trap had sprung. Victor had tried to steal my equity and fake an audit. Instead, he had locked down his entire $450 million company with a single key press. By Friday afternoon, the operational collapse of Vantage Health Systems was total. Because the central 200K compliance code had locked down, every distribution node across the country froze in real time. In Chicago, Atlanta, Dallas, and Seattle, freight trucks loaded with millions of dollars in clinical diagnostic machinery sat idling at warehouse loading docks. Freight carriers refused to cross state lines or clear port authorities because their automated customs manifests lacked the mandatory SEC cryptographic compliance token. Inside corporate headquarters, chaos reigned. Department heads flooded the executive floor demanding answers. System administrators tried desperately to override the red security banners flashing on their screens, only to trigger secondary security protocols that locked out financial payroll ledgers and vendor payout channels. Over the weekend, CFO Victor Thorne realized the terrifying reality of his position. On Saturday morning, his mobile phone began ringing uncontrollably. It was the managing director of MedGlobe Capital, demanding an explanation for why Vantage's automated compliance database had failed to upload the required final due diligence verification records. By Sunday evening, Victor was desperate. He began calling my personal cell phone. First came polite text messages, asking if we could meet for a quiet coffee to resolve a minor operational misunderstanding. When I didn't reply, the messages turned frantic. By Monday morning, September 28th, my phone registered 103 missed calls and 34 voicemail messages from Victor Thorne and Chairman Leonard Thorne. I didn't answer a single call. I had turned my phone over to my attorney, Lawrence Cole. If Victor wanted to speak to me, he would have to do so through legal counsel, under oath, on our terms. On Monday morning at 9 o'clock, MedGlobe Capital's executive takeover team arrived at Vantage headquarters for the scheduled final signing of the $450 million purchase agreement. Chairman Leonard Thorne and Victor sat in the main conference room, sweating through their tailored suits, trying to stall for time. They couldn't stall long enough. At 9:30 a.m., MedGlobe's lead corporate counsel opened his laptop and refreshed the Federal Regulatory Registry. An automated SEC enforcement bulletin popped up on his screen, indicating that Vantage Health Systems had been placed under active federal regulatory inquiry regarding material internal control violations under 15 U.S.C. paragraph 7262. MedGlobe's lead attorney stood up, closed his laptop with a loud click, and looked across the table at Leonard and Victor. "Gentlemen, this transaction is terminated," the MedGlobe attorney stated coldly. "Under Clause 8 of our non-binding letter of intent, any undisclosed SEC compliance inquiry or system tampering constitutes a material adverse event. MedGlobe Capital is withdrawing its $450 million acquisition offer effective immediately. Furthermore, our firm reserves the right to pursue civil litigation against your executive board for fraudulent misrepresentation." The acquisition was dead. The $450 million valuation evaporated in less than 5 minutes. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, an emergency settlement meeting was convened at Lawrence Cole's law office on the 42nd floor of a financial district skyscraper. I sat at the head of the conference table, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, calmly sipping black coffee. Sitting next to me was Lawrence Cole, flanked by stacks of binding legal precedent binders. Across the table sat CFO Victor Thorne and Chairman Leonard Thorne. Leonard looked 10 years older, slumped in his chair, his hands trembling slightly on his cane. Victor's tie was loosened, his eyes hollowed out by 3 sleepless nights. Victor tried one final attempt at corporate dominance. He slammed his palm on the table. "Harold, this has gone far enough," Victor demanded, his voice cracking. "You sabotaged our server architecture. You deliberately destroyed a $450 million transaction out of personal spite. If you don't plug your security token back into the mainframe by 5 o'clock today, our legal team will file a $20 million lawsuit against you for corporate sabotage." Lawrence Cole didn't even look up from his notepad. He reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a thick stapled document, and slid it across the glass table to Victor. "Victor, this is a formal copy of the 47-page whistleblower disclosure we filed with the SEC's Division of Enforcement and the Department of Justice on Friday night," Lawrence said calmly. "It includes forensic digital evidence of your unauthorized $200,000 wire transfer to Panama, your illegal attempt to bypass FDA Title 21 CFR Part 11 records, and full audio recordings of you threatening my client's stock option vesting date to force him into committing federal securities fraud." Victor turned pale as paper. He opened the file, his hands shaking violently as he scanned the SEC intake stamps and statutory citations. "Under 18 U.S.C. paragraph 15(4)(a), Lawrence continued, leaning forward, "retaliatory discharge of an independent compliance officer carries statutory criminal liability for corporate officers who knowingly authorize securities fraud." "You aren't in a position to sue anyone, Victor. You are looking at a federal indictment." Chairman Leonard Thorne turned to his nephew, his face filled with disgust. "You told me you had the compliance checks under control, Victor. You destroyed my company." Leonard turned to me, his voice strained. "Harold, you served this company for 18 years. Tell us what it takes to settle this before federal marshals walk into our headquarters." I set my coffee cup down on the saucer. The room was deathly quiet. "The terms are non-negotiable," I said, looking directly at Victor. "First, full acceleration and immediate cash payout of my $1.2 million equity grant. Second, full payment of my contractual double multiplier severance under Clause 12B, totaling $720,000. Third, $1,680,000 in statutory whistleblower damages under Sarbanes-Oxley 18 U.S.C. paragraph 1514A, making a total cash settlement of $3,600,000 wired into my attorney's escrow account by noon tomorrow." Victor gasped. $3.6 million? That will wipe out our remaining liquid reserves. "And finally," I added, ignoring Victor's outburst, "Victor Thorne submits his immediate unconditional resignation from all executive posts at Vantage Health Systems, effective 5 minutes from now. If those funds are not in escrow by noon tomorrow, my attorney will authorize the Department of Justice to proceed with formal criminal charges." Victor looked at his uncle. Leonard didn't even look back at him. Leonard reached for his pen, signed the preliminary settlement agreement, and pushed it back across the table. The arrogant executive who thought he could steal my 18-year career was completely ruined. And all it took was holding the line on the law. By Tuesday morning, September 29th, at precisely 11:45 a.m., Lawrence Cole's computer chime alerted us to an incoming wire transfer. $3,600,000 cleared into his legal escrow account in full, guaranteed by certified bank funds from Vantage Health Systems' primary financial reserve. Once the funds were verified by our bank, Lawrence handed over the physical RSA, cryptographic hardware security token, to an independent court-appointed compliance monitor, operating under the direct supervision of SEC regulatory officials. Under federal oversight, the monitor conducted a clean, transparent system calibration, clearing the operational freeze while preserving all forensic digital evidence of Victor Thorne's illegal software tampering. The collapse of Victor Thorne's corporate career was swift and absolute. Within 48 hours of my settlement clearing, news of the aborted $450 million MedGlobe Capital takeover leaked to financial news outlets. Vantage Health Systems' stock price plummeted by 62% in single-day trading on Wall Street, wiping out over $200 million in market capitalization. The SEC's Division of Enforcement, working alongside the Food and Drug Administration, launched a formal criminal investigation into Victor's actions. The forensic audit trail left by his $200,000 Panamanian wire transfer and his unauthorized root-level database intrusion provided prosecutors with an airtight case of corporate wire fraud and attempted falsification of federal compliance records. 6 months later, Victor Thorn entered a formal guilty plea in federal district court to secondary charges of corporate wire fraud and filing false regulatory statements. He received a 3-year sentence in federal prison, accompanied by a $500,000 personal fine and a permanent lifetime ban prohibiting him from serving as an officer or director of any publicly traded corporation in the United States. Chairman Leonard Thorn was ousted by the remaining board members in a humiliating emergency shareholder meeting. Disgraced and stripped of his executive voting control, Leonard retired to his estate, his reputation within the financial community completely destroyed. Vantage Health Systems was broken up by creditors, its regional distribution centers sold off at fire sale valuations to competing logistics conglomerates. Not everyone at Vantage suffered, however. Before I departed, I ensured that my senior compliance analyst, Diana Foster, was protected. Recognizing her talent and unwavering integrity, the new board of directors promoted Diana to Chief Compliance Officer, granting her a 50% salary increase and absolute operational authority over the company's internal control matrix. Under Diana's leadership, the remaining logistics hubs achieved perfect scorecards on their federal regulatory audits. As for myself, the $3.6 million settlement provided complete financial independence, but I wasn't ready to sit on a beach and retire at 51. 2 months after the settlement cleared, I founded Advanced Regulatory Consulting LLC, a boutique legal and corporate compliance advisory firm operating out of a quiet, sunlit office in downtown Chicago. My firm specializes in assisting mid-sized medical technology and pharmaceutical distribution corporations in building bulletproof internal controls and protecting their independent auditors from executive overreach. Today, my firm represents 14 growing biotech companies across North America. Executives who hire us know one thing with absolute certainty. When Harold Vance manages your compliance, your corporate ledger will be clean, your regulatory filings will be flawless, and no arrogant executive will ever shortcut the law for a quick payout. Sometimes, corporate climbers with fancy MBAs and expensive suits forget a fundamental truth of the business world. They think rules are just suggestions and that integrity is an optional luxury. They believe that power belongs to whoever holds the highest title in the C-suite. They forget that a company isn't held together by arrogant promises or bloated valuations. It is held together by the quiet, dedicated professionals who inspect the foundation every single day. The people who build the systems, enforce the standards, and hold the master keys. And when a reckless boss tries to force his way through a locked door, he usually discovers too late that the person holding the key isn't afraid to lock him out forever.